There is no political class in Western Europe as cut off from ordinary people as the Irish political class.
Last night there was a big bonfire, loyalists and Republicans marching side by side, protesting against immigration into Ireland. What is the state of immigration into Ireland?
It's out of control. It's like this vast social experiment being carried out by the ruling classes of Dublin. There have been some extremely violent crimes carried out by migrants.
This really regards Kneecap, but seeing as you've been a huge advocate for free speech, to what level should they be able to say what they're saying?
One problem with censorship is that it makes martyrs of muppets.
Sort of paint a picture of Ireland's anti-Israel situation.
It is in the grip of an Israelophobic lunacy. It's been in a post-Catholic moment for some time. Catholicism was its moral anchor. Been looking around for a Catholicism replacement. Like Dublin, Cork, Galway. These are cauldrons of wokeness. History was rewritten, or even worse, history was forgotten.
Okay.
That's a black mark in Irish history.
De Valera actually sent condolences on the suicide of Hitler. That is pretty striking.
It's at some point something will break, but it's hard to see how or when.
Before you hear from Brendan O'Neill, I ask if you want to support this show. All you have to do is press subscribe. If you do that, I can have more phenomenal guests like Brendan exploring the issues you want to hear about that the mainstream media won't touch. And if you head over to winstonmarshall.co.uk, you will have an extended conversation between me and Brendan where he takes your questions. And not only that, you'll get ad-free viewing. But without further ado, Brendan O'Neill. Brendan, thank you so much for coming to speak with me. You are one of the most prolific writers in the country. We've got a few of your books here. I've been, I'd say enjoying might be the wrong word for after the pogrom because it's pretty hard reading, but it's completely compelling. So I recommend that. But the issues I want to get into center around Ireland. It's two things. I want to talk about immigration.
Yeah.
And also the backlash against immigration. As we talk now, last night there was a big bonfire in Northern Ireland at Moyghashel, where there was, people have seen it, at the top there was a boat, sort of effigy of the migrant crossings, and the signage said, we prioritize veterans, not refugees, I think it said, or maybe it said immigrants. But so I want to get into the immigration thing, but the thing I want to start with is anti-Semitism in Ireland. I know that this is going to provoke a lot of people, rub people the long way. Maybe anti-Semitism is the wrong term to use, and you can correct me on this, but it certainly seems there's an anti-Israel thing going on. And you've actually written in The Spectator, it's a new religion. Israelophobia is the new religion of Ireland. Now, before we get into the deep roots of the ideology, I wondered if you might paint a picture of how this, what you see as anti-Israel, or maybe it's anti-Semitism. I mean, people have seen Kneecap talking. We've looked at the president, Michael D. Higgins, and his various. We'll get into some of those details. But perhaps, Brendan, you can sort of paint a picture of Ireland's anti-Israel situation.
Yeah, Ireland is awash with Israelophobia. I mean, it is in the grip of an Israelophobic lunacy. It's not an exaggeration to say that. And that's why I called it the new religion. The state religion in Ireland for a very long time, of course, was Catholicism, Roman Catholicism. And it was a pretty widespread phenomenon. It informed everyone's lives. You would see statues of the Virgin Mary on the side of the road. People would often stop their cars and get out and say a prayer and then get back on to driving. Everyone went to Mass every Sunday. Everyone went to Catholic school. The vast majority of Irish people went to Catholic school. So that was the state religion for a long time. It feels to me now, in the post-Catholic era, there's this search for a new religious ethos or a new kind of moral glue that might hold sections of society together, give them a sense of purpose, give them a sense of mission. And currently that takes the form of Israelophobia. It is omnipresent in Ireland. Of course, you see it in Dublin, which is, I would say, one of the wokest cities in Europe. But you also see it in the countryside. My parents are from the extreme west of Ireland, very, very rural, a lot of bogland, a lot of
Connemara.
A lot of windswept areas. Even there, in the middle of nowhere, you'll be driving along and you'll see a Palestine flag fluttering in some lonely field. Um, you'll see that stop signs on the road have had the word genocide attached to them, so it says stop genocide. You switch on local Galway radio and you will hear people talking about going on hunger strike for Gaza, or the evils of Israel, or why the Irish government is not doing enough to turn Israel into a pariah state, which is what these people think it is. It's suffocating. You can almost taste the hatred on your tongue when you walk through these towns and cities. I find it incredibly depressing that the Irish establishment in particular, but also significant numbers of Irish people, now devote themselves to this kind of ritualistic hatred for one country, the Jewish nation.
Can we just stop on the post-Catholic era? What do you? It's still a Catholic country. It's still a Christian country, isn't it?
Yes, it's still a Catholic country. Constitutionally, it's a Catholic country. It's in the Constitution. We're a Catholic country. But it's been in a post-Catholic moment for some time. There's been huge scandals in the Catholic Church over the past 20 or 30 years. Numbers of people going to Mass is dwindling. People have far less respect for the priests and the nuns than they had in the past. A massive crisis of legitimacy for the Catholic Church in Ireland, to such an extent that it just does not have the social or moral clout that it used to enjoy. This used to be the most important institution in Ireland. Priests would tell people off on Sundays for how they were living. Priests would suggest to them how they might vote in an election. Priests would govern almost every aspect of their lives. My parents tell me those stories, how dominant the priests were, how dominant the nuns were. They were the moral tyrants in some ways of this small new republic that was only born in 1916, 1922, around that time. And there's a real crisis of Catholicism. It's waning massively. It doesn't have that power anymore. And that's been going on for really 20 or 30 years.
And you think that tracks back to the paedophile scandals?
The paedophile scandal was more an expression of it. There's just that kind of general corrosion of Catholic authority as Ireland became more socially liberal, more open to the outside world. Younger people were less willing to take instruction from priests or nuns. You know, there was the vote to decriminalize divorce in the 1990s, the vote to decriminalize homosexuality, or homosexuality was decriminalized. And Ireland became more socially liberal. And the rule of the Catholics waned, and the crises didn't help. The Magdalene laundries, where the nuns would imprison young women whose crime was to have given birth out of wedlock, or, you know, the paedophile scandals, all of those things contributed to a sense that this was a knackered institution that had no right to tell people how to live. And that created a massive vacuum in Ireland because Catholicism was its moral anchor. Without it, Ireland was a pretty listless place. It didn't know what it was for, what it believed in, what its purpose was. And since then, it's been looking around, I think, as a nation, particularly in Dublin, amongst the influential classes. They've been looking around for a Catholicism replacement, some ideology around which they might cohere themselves. They found it in their devotion to the European Union. They found it in their devotion to wokeness. Ireland is an insanely woke country. And now, more recently, since 7th of October, they found it in this shared frothing hatred for the Jewish state. And I think the Jewish state has almost become like a substitute devil. You know, you used to pray to keep the devil out of your life, and now Israel plays that role for many people in Ireland. It's really worrying. So
it's a sort of anti-Israel, or Israelophobia, as you call it, is a pseudo-religion, quasi-religion, a bit like the climate religion or wokeism or the trans ideology that has taken the place in a society which no longer believes in God, maybe.
Yeah.
That's part of the analysis.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the Israelophobia has the downsides of religion and none of the upsides. So it has the downsides of that desire to order things in a very simplistic way. So it has the bad guys, the devilish guys, who are the Israelis, who are looked upon as an alien people, not only by Irish influencers, but in Britain and across Europe. Israelis are seen as being in the grip of a genocidal mania, as being a uniquely barbarous and racist people. I mean, the neo-colonial contempt for the people of Israel, I find absolutely disgraceful and absurd, and you hear it all the time. They're talked about as an morally inferior species in the same way that Africans might have been during the era of Victorian colonialism. They're looked upon as a uniquely barbarous, savage people. You hear that, you see that in The Guardian. You see that on X every single day. You see it in these marches against Israel that take place all the time. And you see it in Ireland. So they've got their new satanic force that they must conquer and extinguish from the earth, i.e. the Jewish nation, which they want to get rid of from the river to the sea. And they've got their good guys as well, the Palestinians, who they see as the perennial victims, you know, responsible for nothing. They infantilize them. It's the kind of double bigotry of Israelophobia, where they demonize Israel, which I think is a form of bigotry, and they infantilize Palestinians and Arabs, treat them as the children of the earth who require us to parent them and save them and look after them. That kind of double bigotry is so pronounced in influential circles in Ireland, and people do now cohere themselves and their entire sense of personality around that worldview.
Yeah, that's what they used to call the bigotry of low expectations. For what you're describing, their attitude towards Palestinians. Just sorry, another pit stop is that you say Ireland is the most woke country in the world. How so?
You know, I love Ireland, but it's really annoying sometimes.
You are Irish. You
I'm
consider
Irish.
yourself Irish.
Yeah.
You weren't. Were you born? Your
I was
parents
born
are
in
still
London.
Born in London.
My parents are Irish. They migrated to London in 1970 because they needed to work, and lots of Irish people came to the UK to work. That's where they had their children. That's where me and my brothers were all born.
And let's take a quick look at how the media is reporting on Keir Starmer's new crackdown plan using Ground News. Left-leaning Channel 4 ran the headline, Starmer vows to significantly reduce migration figures. We specifically partnered with Ground News because their app and website help me and my team cut through media bias and get the full picture on any story, like this one. There are multiple articles published on Starmer's new plan, and we can access every single one through Ground News, complete with source, context, and key breakdowns. Meanwhile, right-leaning The Express led with, moment Keir Starmer is left red-faced and brutal press conference. Shot yourself in the foot. Two very different narratives from the left and the right on the same story. Seeing all sides, regardless of political lean, is essential to making informed decisions and spotting bias. That's why Ground News' blind spot feed, which highlights stories underreported by either side, is such a powerful tool. I genuinely believe in what Ground News is doing, and I encourage you to check it out by scanning the QR code or visiting ground.news/Winston. If you subscribe through my link, you'll get 40% off unlimited access. Ground News is subscriber funded, so by supporting my sponsors, you are supporting this show.
I did 23andMe recently. I know that's a stupid thing to do, and I'm like 96% Irish. I'm like a thoroughbred Mick. I mean, cut me open and it's just Guinness and shamrocks. It's insane. That's who I am. That's, you know, when I go to the doctors and you have to fill in a form, my ethnicity is white Irish. That's who I am. I love Ireland. I go there all the time. I love going there, seeing family, friends, but it can be an annoying place, and it is hyper woke. Especially the cities like Dublin, Cork, Galway. These are cauldrons of wokeness. These are the kinds of places where the trans ideology is still very pronounced. They haven't had the breakthroughs that we've had on Turf Island here in the UK, where we've now established by law that a man is a man and a woman is a woman. They're still awaiting that enlightenment. They are super pro-EU. They loathe Brexit with a passion. Everyone you meet who reads the Irish Times and watches the right TV shows, they will say to you, Brexit's the worst thing that's ever happened. They're rabidly anti-Brexit. They hate Israel. The Palestine flag flies everywhere. Yeah. I mean, every idea of wokeness, every ideology of wokeness is incredibly pronounced in Ireland. And the key thing about Ireland, which I think it's important for people to understand, there is no political class in Western Europe as cut off from ordinary people as the Irish political class. They're ensconced in their citadels in Dublin, in a small part of Dublin, in fact. They don't understand the people out in the country, the people in the West, where my parents are from, the people down south, the people who live more rural lives or village lives or town lives, of which it's the many people, they don't understand those people. They look upon them as almost an alien species. They look upon them with contempt. And that comes through on issues that you mentioned earlier, like immigration. You know, the divide between these two universes
Well,
is
hang
huge.
on a second. It seems like there's a bit of a contradiction, because if I look at the political classes in Ireland, and I think the last time I saw you was in Dublin,
Yeah.
around the women's protest led by Posey Parker, and there were sort of Leninist trans counter protests at the same time. Quite literally Leninist. I mean, they had placards of Lenin. Which tells you
He was a
everything
big
you need to know.
supporter of trans ideology, Vladimir Lenin.
But if you look at the behavior of the elites, it is quite woke, and it is pretty anti-Israel. So, and the way you describe Ireland with all these flags everywhere, it actually sounds that the elites and the people are on the same page on this.
Well, that's the thing that does worry me about Israelophobia, and I touched on that in my Spectator piece, where I deluded myself, I think, into thinking that it was primarily a city phenomenon. It was something around Trinity College in Dublin and the Irish Times and those kind of influential opinion-setting classes. But it's more widespread than that. So that issue in particular is, I think, increasingly widespread. I don't think everyone holds that view. I think a lot of people in Ireland probably don't even think about this conflict very much. But where there are people keen to make a political expression, they will all be anti-Israel. So that's quite widespread. That's not just an establishment thing.
Okay.
But then the other forms of wokeness are like trans, for example. When I talk to my cousins, family, friends in the west of Ireland, they think that's complete bollocks. They just don't buy that at all.
Right.
And when an Irish man called Barbie Kardashian was put into Limerick Women's Prison, despite having threatened to murder his own mother, he identifies as a woman, he was put in Limerick's prison, people were up in arms about that. Ordinary people were furious. They thought it was repulsive that this man was put into a women's prison, where he then went on to threaten women who worked at or were detained in that prison. So on issues like that, there is a whole load of common sense.
There are some issues where there's discord between the elites and the people.
Yeah.
And then there's other issues, it seems like, when it comes to Israel, where there's
more accord.
Between the two.
Yeah, not entire unity, but more of a connection, I would say.
So you've described the sort of vacuum left by the sort of fall from God or move away from theism that is part of the ideology, the anti-Israel ideology. But obviously it's the case that you mentioned in passing post-colonial, or I think neocolonialism is the word you used, but this sort of post-colonialism ideology, the term I keep hearing, I've just heard it again on stage with Kneecap, who are actually from Northern Ireland, but they're Republicans. They have been all sorts of trouble with anti-terrorist police. I think they've been acquitted because it was past the statute of limitations, but they on stage did say up Hamas, up Hezbollah. They did say death to kill Tories or whatever, something along the line of death to kill your local Tory MP, I think. I might be getting that wrong. But I think they've been acquitted because it was past the statute of limitations. Nevertheless, they one of the things they say, and many Republican types say, is we've had 800 years of oppression, but the greatest oppression, the greatest injustice in the world today is what's going on in Israel. So they're clearly mapping over what's going on over in Israel to what's going on in their experience or their conception of what their own history is. There is an irony there, which is that they're Republicans and they want sovereignty, and yet they're anti-Zionist, and to be Zionist is Jewish people wanting sovereignty. So how do you see that? Can you explain if they're right to make that a comparison, or whether it's wrong? How can you unpack that for me?
Their levels of historical ignorance are astounding to me. People like Kneecap, their fans, their followers, the people in the media who defend them, and other people who say the reason the Irish are so passionate about the Palestinian question is because it's just like what we went through. What Israel is doing to the Palestinians is just like what the British did to the Irish for 800 years. You hear that all the time. It's complete nonsense. It is complete nonsense. It is fueled by a willful ignorance of Irish history. Because if you look back at Ireland in the 20th century, certainly up to 67 and the 1970s, Ireland was very favourable of Israel. Now, there were issues of antisemitism, kind of old-fashioned Catholic-fueled anti-Semitism here and there, and there may have been a hostility to Jews in certain ways of thinking. But Ireland saw Israel as being the new state of Israel, born in 1948. It saw it as being very similar to Ireland, this plucky little country born out of a anti-colonial revolt against the British. Both the Zionist revolutionaries and the Irish revolutionaries kicked British forces out of their land and said, we want to rule it ourselves. The Irish did it in the 1910s and the 1920s. The Jewish revolutionaries did it in the 1940s. Israel was seen by many Irish people as this, crazy, plucky little country conquered and taken over and reestablished, the ancient homeland reestablished by a ragtag of refugees from Europe who fled Nazi persecution. And like the Irish, it has a diaspora scattered around the world. The Jews are scattered around the world. Like the Irish, it has a very traumatic history of oppression, the Jews and the Irish. Like the Irish, it defied all the odds and kicked the British Empire out of the land that they wanted to rule themselves. There were commonalities, and those commonalities were physical and ideological, not just in terms of that understanding, but, if you look at Yitzhak Shamir, who was a key Jewish revolutionary, went on to become one of Israel's early prime ministers. His underground name, when he was involved in the Zionist uprising against the British, his underground name was Michael, which he got from Michael Collins, the famous leader of the Irish War of Independence. One of the most famous Irish Jews is a guy called Robert Briscoe. He was an arms purchaser for the IRA during the War of Independence. He later became the first ever Jewish Lord Mayor of Dublin in the 1970s. He gave advice to Menahem Begin about how to turn his Zionist revolutionary force into a political party that would govern this new state. Michael Collins himself, many viewers will know, he's, very well-known Irish revolutionary. He once hid from the Brits amongst the Orthodox Jews of Dublin. He dressed as an Orthodox Jew to escape the attentions of the British forces. There were lots of connections. There was a lot of spiritual, moral, and political commonality between the Irish, who saw themselves as having expelled their British oppressors, and the Jews, these revolutionary Jews who had just come through the greatest crime in human history, and yet still had the wherewithal and the moral strength and the desire to say to Britain, get the hell out of mandatory Palestine. This is Israel. It always has been, and it will be now forevermore. I mean, imagine the strength and the courage that must take in any situation, never mind after the Holocaust. So there was that sense that we were both nations born from national liberation, born from a sense of daring and a sense of self-belief and confidence. And that lasted, that vision of Ireland and Israel being similar, lasted for a long time. Then it shifts really when the PLO become a major player in the 1960s and the 1970s. The PLO starts to say we're like the IRA because the IRA came back into action in the 1970s in Northern Ireland. And then this idea developed that the Palestinian cause was just like the Irish cause and Israel is just like the Brits. History was rewritten, or even worse, history was forgotten. And when I hear those stupid idiots of Kneecap and their fans saying what they say, that the Irish are just like the Palestinians, I just want to shake them by the scruff of the neck, because actually, historically speaking, morally speaking, Ireland has a great deal in common with Israel, and we should take pride in that, but we've forgotten it.
There's another aspect to that, which is that the international left, up until the 1967 war, were actually
That's right.
pro-Israel.
Yeah.
An inversion of what they today. Even in Britain, the Prime Minister Harold Wilson, the Labour Prime Minister Harold Wilson, wrote a pro-Israel book, I think about 1965. I might get that date wrong, but I think one of the things that might have flipped it was that Israel was so successful in the 67 war, and they managed to have such a convincing victory and capturing of territory that they, in the progressive paradigm of oppressor-oppressed, it was maybe that it was harder to see them as the oppressed anymore. That's sort of one aspect.
I think that's right. I think the 67 war was a big turning point for that reason. Prior to that, in the late 40s and throughout the 50s and 60s, Israel was seen as the small state threatened by far larger, more powerful states, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, even Lebanon. Israel was seen as, and in fact, in Ireland and other countries in Europe, it was those Arab states that were seen as the truly problematic colonial powers in the Middle East. They were the colonial powers that were threatening this little Jewish nation born from the fires of the Holocaust. So that's how it was understood for at least 2 decades. It does start to change around 67, precisely because of Israel's success, precisely because it wasn't going to take this shit lying down. It was then seen, people thought maybe it's stronger than we thought. And in that kind of naff countercultural politics that emerged in the late 60s and certainly through the 70s, where everything started to be understood in a very narrow, in the very narrow terminology of power relations, and you even had the early origins of identity politics, and who's on the side of right, who's on the side of bad, and of course there was so much Soviet propaganda and so much PLO propaganda, which was reimagining the conflict in the Middle East as Israel being the colonial settler power and the Arab states, or certainly the Palestinian people, being the oppressed. And that narrative fed in very neatly to a newly emerging new left that loved those kind of simplistic understandings of world affairs. One of the great tragedies of the Western left was its shift on the Israel question. I think so much of the rot that we currently face in terms of the problem of left-wing anti-Semitism, the problem of this kind of left valorization of the noble savage. The Palestinians are seen as noble savages. The way they're talked about, I find incredibly racist. All of those kind of ideas, which are incredibly pronounced today on the streets, in the newspapers, in everyday conversation, they all come from the left's unforgivable betrayal of the state of Israel, which happens in the 60s and the 70s.
So one thing you've already done to enlighten me there is that actually I didn't even really know that there was a pro-Israel heritage in Ireland, because having looked into it, the history, particularly in the Second World War, Ireland's behaviour there. Now, you'll definitely have to enlighten me on this, but there was rumours that they were allowing Nazi submarines there, although I haven't seen any proof that was the case. I think that at the end of the war, there was some Nazi submarines captured nearby or something, or maybe torpedoed nearby Irish shores. I don't know if you can colour that in for me, but it's also the behaviour of De Valera, the Taoiseach during the war, and I think he was president later, post-war, but they were neutral in the Second World War, and probably almost certainly because of their sort of dogmatic Anglophobia, right? For them, it was like, you're an enemy of our enemy is our friend. And that's probably the lens through which they saw it. How do you see the neutrality of Ireland during the Second World War?
Yeah, not good. And you're right to raise that, because it's a conflictual situation. So on the one hand, certainly after 1948, so after the war, when Israel is successfully set up following the expulsion of the end of British rule under the pressure of the Zionist revolutionaries, Ireland started to see Israel as a country similar to Ireland. That definitely starts to happen for a period of time, but it's still a conflictual thing, because you're right to say that during the Second World War, Ireland was neutral. That did come from its anti-Britishness. It's worth bearing in mind that, when the Second World War started in 1939, Ireland didn't get independence really until 1922. So how many years is that? That's 17 years after Ireland finished fighting its wars with Britain. So the tensions are still going to be huge, right? The tensions between those two countries are still going to be huge. And Ireland is not about to sign up with Britain, even though I think it should have, because we were fighting a war against the greatest threat mankind has ever faced. Some Irish people did go and fight.
Quite a lot, right?
Yeah.
Quite a lot of Irish did sign up to fight with the Allies.
Yeah, they did.
Another example of the elites and the people in Ireland behaving
That's right.
not exactly in accord.
A lot of Irish people knew that it was the right thing to do and that the Nazis had to be defeated. And they signed up, and that's great. And that really it's to Ireland's credit that they did that.
Great honour.
But it is, and Ireland was never shy about using even world wars to embarrass its old British enemies. Let's not forget that the Easter Uprising that really gave rise to the Irish Republic in 1916, that was intentionally launched in Dublin at the General Post Office when a band of revolutionaries took over the General Post Office in Dublin, which is still there. It's still a working post office. And they proclaimed the Irish Republic. They famously put a notice on the door saying, this is now the Irish Republic. That's where Ireland comes from. That was done in 1916, and it was intentionally done in 1916 in the middle of the First World War, when Britain was in Europe and its forces were in Europe, and it was facing lots of threats on lots of fronts, and the Irish revolutionaries wanted to exploit that. And during the Second World War, they similarly were not about to align with Britain, because they still saw them as the enemy. They still saw them as the old former rulers who'd been kicked out less than 20 years earlier. So, yes, that was wrong, in my view. They should have recognized the threat Europe was facing from Nazism. They should have recognized that this inhuman ideology was the worst thing mankind had ever seen. Some of them did, but the leadership of
Well,
the
it's actually
country
worse.
didn't.
So Eamon de Valera actually sent condolences on the suicide of Hitler.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's really quite something. I think that it is the case that about 1939 they back off a little bit on their friendliness with the Nazis, but that is pretty striking and shows like
that's a black mark in Irish history.
Yeah.
And people talk about it a lot, and people are shocked when they discover that if they discover that happened. But so if you look at the 20th century and Ireland's relationship with the Jews and then with the Jewish state, it's a difficult one. It's a tortured one. It's a complicated one, because there has been anti-Semitism in Ireland, unquestionably, and there is today in spades.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there was a period of time in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s when Ireland, lots and lots of Irish people looked favorably upon Israel, this new nation, new nation on an old nation that seemed to be like us. So it's a complicated relationship, but it's one that is really worth thinking about, and what it means for all of us to stand with Israel or not stand with Israel.
Yeah. There's another component to the ideology that I wanted to explore with you. And you might say I'm absolutely wrong to think this, but hey, perhaps it's a little bit out there. But it's to do with the Second Vatican Council, and specifically the Nostra Aetate. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that, the Latin. But so 1962 to 65, the Vatican come in with a bunch of reforms to the Catholic Church. And regarding the Jews, they completely go against, override an important part of, or a significant anti-Semitic part of pre-Vatican II Catholicism, which was blaming the Jews for Christ's death, deicide charge, as they call it, and they saw Jews as Christ killers. Now, what's that got to do with Ireland? Well, there weren't, unlike the rest of Europe, there had never been that many Jews in Ireland. So my looking into it was that it wasn't something that was given that much attention to in Ireland by those in the church, because there weren't so many Jews. I mean, we're talking a few thousand, I think.
Yeah.
And this pre-Vatican II Catholicism, where they do see the Jews as the perfidious Jews, I think is the term they use in Good Friday prayers. This Catholicism had an influence on the culture that maybe wasn't eradicated like it or snuffed out like it was elsewhere. As a side note, it's speculative, but I think some of the anti-Semitism we're seeing on the right coming out of America, I think it's because some of them are pre-Vatican II Catholics.
Right.
Now, but I can only speculate that because I don't know the actual theology of these specific individuals in the commentariat that we're seeing. But that may be a conversation for another time. But do you think there's anything in this, the influence or the lack of influence of Vatican II in Ireland?
I do think there's something in it. I think, when people ask me what's Ireland's problem with Jews, I often say, and this is a bit of a simplistic explanation, but I think there's something in it. I think one of Ireland's problems is it went from one anti-Semitic religion to another. So it went from Catholicism. I'm not saying Catholicism is defined by its anti-Semitism at all.
Well, pre-Vatican II,
there was a lot of anti-Semitism, yeah, absolutely. But it went from pre-Vatican II Catholicism, which dominated the country up to the 60s, to wokeness, which in my view is the new religion, and it's also anti-Semitic. So if you look at a country like Ireland that switches almost without taking a breath between that kind of ancient religion, which had this vision of Jews as the killers of Christ, the great deicides, the figure of Judas, for example. I've just read a book about the history of depictions of Judas in Western art, Western literature, Western churches. And Judas became the ultimate Jew. You know, he's the figure of the Jew. He always was made to look very Jewish. In paintings, he was seen as, you know, the great traitor, the betrayer of Christ, and the Jews screwed up Christ's life and Christ's mission. That was the story that lots of Catholics were told, certainly pre-Vatican II. And
his name doesn't help. Yeah.
Well, and so they go from a religion that saw the Jews as Christ killers to this new religion that sees the Jews as Palestinian killers, child killers, as the intentional, rabid, bloodlusting destroyers of Palestinian life.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, the thing that always strikes me about Israelophobia, and I talk about this in my book After the Pogrom, is the way in which hatred for Israel today so closely mimics hatred for the Jews in the past.
How so?
Well, all the things that people used to say about the Jewish people, they now say about the Jewish nation. So they used to say the Jewish people loved to kill children. They drained their blood, the blood libel. They drained their blood. They used it to make bread. They drank it. They were, you know, they loved to kill Christian children. Now we see that mimicked and rehabilitated in the idea that Israel, unique among the nations of the world, targets children for death. It loves to kill children. You see that prejudice all over the place. Also, the idea that the Jews were a uniquely perfidious people, a uniquely barbarous people, that has been rehabilitated in the hatred for the Jewish nation. You know, Owen Jones in The Guardian described Israel's war in Gaza as uniquely murderous. Unique among the evils of the world is this war in Gaza.
It's not even the most uniquely murdered.
No.
The death toll isn't even compared to what's going on in Ukraine. So
Not
it's
at
not
all.
even right now. Is
No.
it not the most?
Absolutely.
As far as I don't accept that it is murder.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Exactly. Even by death toll, it's not comparable to any of these other conflicts. And then when you look back to the war in the Congo, for example, which no one talks about, in which millions died, 20 years ago, 25 years ago. So that's another ancient libel, ancient form of bigotry that's been rehabilitated in Israelophobia. And then, of course, the old idea that the Jews were a manipulative people, very powerful, kind of puppeteering world affairs, that's been 100% rebuilt on the altar of Israelophobia. This idea that the Jewish nation has America and Britain eaten out of the palms of its hands. It's the secret controller of world events. And, it's you also see it in this notion that, when people in Europe, in medieval Europe, who at least had the excuse of being uneducated and couldn't read, they were illiterate and they were farmers and they lived in towns and they were not particularly enlightened people. When they saw the Jews as the pox in their own lives. If their crops failed, they would blame Jewish people. If someone went missing, they'd say the Jews took that person. If they ran out of money, they'd say it's because the Jews are moneylenders. They're hoarding everything. The Jews were the explanation for everything that went wrong in their own lives. We now see that in relation to the Jewish nation. And you're right to raise the problem of the right, because we see it on the right as well as the left. This notion that if only Israel didn't exist, we'd have world peace. If only Israel didn't exist, we could really have America first and we could really sort out America's problems. If only Israel didn't exist, then, you wouldn't have all these tensions in Europe and all these kind of conflicts and between Muslims and Jews and everything else. The Jewish nation has been redefined as the source of all the world's ills in the way that the Jewish people were once seen as the source of all the world's ills. So, anti-Semitism is a very unique form of racism because it's not just bigotry against a group of people on the basis of their heritage or their skin color. And we can all agree all forms of racism are wicked. It's not just that. It's a search for evil. It treats the Jewish people, or today the Jewish nation, as a cauldron of evil, as the source of evil, as the force that is undermining civilized life, undermining democratic life, undermining everyday life. That's how the Jews were once seen, and that's now how the Jewish state is seen. And to me, it cannot be a coincidence that all the bile and bigotry that was once visited on the Jewish people is now openly visited on the Jewish state.
I want to understand the president of Ireland, Michael D. Higgins. So there's this, Israel have said they were going to remove the embassy in Ireland. So that's a pretty good indicator of things not being good in Ireland. And there's also this curious case where at a Holocaust memorial, the President Higgins made it all about, not October 7th, on the contrary, he made it all about the quote-unquote genocide going on in Gaza. A bunch of representatives from the Israel embassy stood up with their back turned towards him. This actually was earlier this year. This was in January 2025. And so you see relations completely deteriorating. And just to colour in what you said about the genocidal blood libel, it was Israel who supported South Africa in the international courts, in the ICJ, about the accusation of genocide against Israel, and it hasn't been found that they are genocidal. This is what I was just at a Billie Eilish concert last night. This is completely a side point, but I was quite enjoying the support act, a young American woman called Sid, and then complete non sequitur in the middle of the show, she goes, "Free Palestine! I'm against genocide." I'm like, what? What has this got to do with your music? And what on earth are you talking about? But anyway, that's got nothing to do with Ireland. But it's just this genocide libel that you mention is everywhere, and it seems that the Irish are leading the front in the international courts. So how can you colour that in for me? What do I need to know there?
Well, I'm going to see Billie Eilish this weekend, so thank you for for warning me about the support act.
I'll give you more. Wait, sorry, just as it was there. Billie Eilish has banned all straws. All the food is vegan. There's a video before she goes on about the climate crisis.
Oh, God. That's going to be a great night out for me.
And there's a little segment in the show where she talks about how dark the world is today. But it's a really good show.
She's
So anyway,
the genocide thing, it's gross. It's a lie. Israel's not committing a genocide in Gaza by any definition. It doesn't have the intent to do so. It's fighting against Hamas. It makes that pretty clear. We're not told the truth about what's happening in Gaza. It is actually the most lied about war of my lifetime. Because over the past week, for example, the week before you and I are speaking, Israel has killed around 100 Hamas terrorists in Gaza. It has destroyed more tunnels, and it has destroyed more of Hamas's heavy weaponry. You don't see any of that in the news coverage. You just see more death and destruction. Civilians have died. Civilians die in all wars. That's why most people hate wars. They're awful. War is hell. People say that for a reason because it's true, and it's certainly hellish for the people of Gaza. But what Israel is doing is targeting Hamas and targeting them effectively. It has taken out almost its entire leadership, huge numbers of its foot soldiers and its terrorists and its mass murderers, people who carried out the 7th of October pogrom. But we don't hear about that. Hamas is invisibilized. We never see them on the BBC News. We never hear about them. We never hear about their death tolls that they are suffering. It's just all this idea that Israel is in Gaza to kill civilians, and it's grotesquely untrue. It's the modern blood libel. So there is no genocide in Gaza, but what Ireland's role in this is shameful. So you have Michael D. Higgins, exploiting, hijacking a Holocaust memorial event to condemn the modern Jewish nation for committing a modern day Holocaust. It's repulsive. He was supposed to be commemorating the suffering of the Jews. What he actually did was weaponize the suffering of the Jews against the Jews. He took their history and he rubbed their faces in it. He said, "You now have become the monsters that once persecuted you." It was such a shameful thing to do, but people are so caught up in this moment of unhinged Israelophobia that they are even incapable of taking a step back and saying, why is the Irish president using a Holocaust memorial to damn the Jews of today as genocidaires? It's such a disgusting thing to do. And Ireland's gone even further than that. The government of Ireland, Micheál Martin, the Taoiseach, and Simon Harris, the Taoiseach, the Deputy Prime Minister, they are calling for a redefinition of the term genocide. They want the term genocide to be watered down, to be loosened, to be less restrictive. They're openly arguing for this because they can't find Israel guilty of genocide. So they want to redefine the entire meaning of genocide in order that they might be able to find it guilty. That's Orwellian, where you are rewriting words themselves so that they better suit your ideological purposes. You're interfering with language, with the words we use every day, which have really, words like genocide have a very important meaning. You're interfering with that, you're meddling with that in order to find the state that you hate guilty of the worst crime imaginable. So Ireland is not just pointing the finger at Israel and screaming genocide. It's insulting the Jewish people. It's insulting the Jewish people of Israel. It's insulting our collective memory, historical memory, even language itself, all to its obsessive end of seeing Israel in the court of law so that it might be damned to hell. And that's a really depraved mission for the Irish elites to be pursuing.
I've got to ask before we move on from the issue of Israel and Ireland about, it really regards Kneecap, but seeing as you've been a huge advocate for free speech, do you think I guess one might say persecution of Kneecap for being so openly anti-Israel do you think that the attempts to, let's say, the BBC not airing them on Glastonbury, are you against that on free speech grounds, or to what level should they be able to say what they're saying? Has it gone too far, do you think?
I am against it on free speech grounds because I think people should be free to say whatever they want.
Even up Hamas, Hezbollah? Yeah?
I'm a free speech absolutist. I mean, that's technically against the law, so that's a problem for Kneecap.
It's against the Terrorism Act.
Yeah, you can't praise prescribed organizations, and they are both prescribed organizations. So that,
So you change that law?
I would change that law, but that law does exist. So if you're going to do that, if you're going to praise those organizations, you do have to take the consequences. If I'm going to go out there and praise an organization that's against the law, and I don't want to do that to make a point about freedom of speech, I can do that, but I will have to take the consequences of my actions. So they should have been aware of that. But I am a free speech absolutist. I think they should be free to say what they want to say. But, one problem with censorship, among many others, is that it makes martyrs of Muppets. And that's exactly what it's done with Kneecap. It has turned these three historically ignorant idiots, these theatre kids in their stupid tricolour balaclavas who sing the worst rap songs imaginable, numpties with attitude, I call them. It's turned them into these, it's turned them into these heroes of free speech, into these oppressed warriors, when in fact they're just giving voice to the most commonplace prejudice in the bourgeois society, which is that Israel is evil and the Palestinians are victims. I mean, there's nothing radical about that. That's the belief you'll see on every university campus, in every broadsheet newspaper, and it's the dinner party belief. So they're not even saying anything radical. So censorship gives them that sex appeal and allure and radicalness that they actually otherwise lack. But it's like but at the same time, and I've said this to so many people, we do have to get real about what Kneecap has said, because on the 8th of October, when some of the 6,000 strong army that invaded Israel on the 7th of October, some of them were still there. We have this tendency to, I think, some of us have a tendency to think the 7th of October was just this opportunistic thing. The fences came down, people poured over, they carried out wicked acts. No, this was years in the planning. It was an army of 6,000 armed Islamists. They invaded Israel by sea, land, and air. And they did so with the intention of killing as many people as possible. And
How by sea?
They came in from the coast.
Oh, did they?
And they came in on their paragliders, and they came in obviously by land on their bikes, on their cars, 6,000 strong, including Hamas's elite troops trained by Iran. They invaded Israel. They were there for more than a day. They killed 1,200 people. So when Kneecap posts on the 8th of October, while the worst mass murder of Jews since the Holocaust is still taking place, they posted on X, smiling. They were all smiling in this photograph, and they said solidarity with the Palestinian resistance.
Wow.
They were singing the praises of the fascistic slaughter of Jews. That's an incredibly serious matter. When they say up Hamas, they're singing the praises of the army of anti-Semites that murdered more Jews in one day than anyone else has since the 1940s. When they say up Hezbollah, they're singing the praises of a movement founded with the express intention of excising the cancer of Zionism from the Middle East and sending the Jews back to Germany. That's what Hezbollah says. When one of Kneecap's members poses, as he did on X, he posed with a copy of Hassan Nasrallah's book, Hassan Nasrallah being the late leader of Hezbollah. In that book, Hassan Nasrallah refers to Jews as the descendants of monkeys and pigs. Now, just imagine, if you will, that there was a pop act that said up the KKK, or that posed with a copy of a book that referred to black people as apes, or which sang the praises of a neo-Nazi far-right militia that killed more than 1,000 black people or 1,000 Jewish people. Do you think that band would be praised? Do you think they'd be welcomed with open arms to Glastonbury? Do you think the Guardian columnists would be gushing over them and defending their freedom of speech? Absolutely not. They'd be cancelled like that. The reason Kneecap's not cancelled is because it's just Jews. And they don't give a fuck about Jews. And that is the God's honest truth of why there is this love and support for Kneecap, despite the fact that they are on record singing the praises of fascistic armies that murder Jewish people.
How do I understand Kneecap's Republican ideology? What are they, for people who aren't sort of familiar with it, how would you describe what they believe about what's going on in Ireland? And
it's very infantile, I think. And I think it's quite performative. You know, these are, as they say themselves, these are Good Friday kids. And what that means is that these are young men, apart from the one with the balaclava who's like 40. That's quite embarrassing.
Really?
Yeah, he's really old. He's a former school teacher who is, I think, almost 40. It's
how did he end up in the band? Wow.
Well, they've made a film about it, but I'm not going to watch it, so someone can tell us. But the two younger ones, the front men, they are Good Friday kids, which means they were born around the time of the Good Friday Agreement of 1998. They were born after that, I guess. And they, so they've never known the Troubles. They don't know what it means. They don't know what that conflict was like. It was horrible. Anyone old enough to remember it will know that it was horrible. More than 3,000 people died in that conflict. Most of them were young people. There were bombs going off every single day in Northern Ireland and often in the UK as well. It was not a nice conflict, certainly not something to glamorize. Even their name, Kneecap. Kneecap was the punishment meted out by the IRA in their own communities. Because the IRA policed their own communities quite severely, Catholic communities, because they didn't want anyone to be a tout giving information to the British Army. They didn't want anyone to be selling drugs, committing petty crime, undermining the struggle, as the IRA would have seen it. So one of the punishments they gave out to people was kneecapping. They would shoot them in the kneecap, which is pretty severe and sometimes lethal. Certainly it could disable someone for a period of time. So kneecap is named after a paramilitary punishment that was primarily targeted at Irish Catholics by the IRA. Also, the great irony is that Kneecap would have been kneecapped. Kneecap loves to sing about drugs. They sing about taking ketamine and taking this and that and the other and getting off their heads. That's pretty much all they rap about. The IRA was, famously anti-drugs. And it came down hard on people in Catholic areas who were selling drugs. And it often kneecapped them. So kneecap would have been kneecapped. That's the great irony of all of this. But their republicanism, I think the way to understand it is that it's cosplay. It's a costume. They are, they're these bored, not rich kids, but they're these bored kids from a kind of community centre leftism. They love speaking the Irish language. They love that kind of cultural. They're like a cultural studies outfit. It's very bland and boring, actually. So they try and sex it up by saying up the Ra, up the IRA, wearing a balaclava.
What's bland and boring?
Their worldview.
Their worldview.
Their worldview. It's nothing that you wouldn't hear on an open university lecture about dying languages. I mean, if you listen to what they say, it's very kind of off that ilk. They talk about the importance of speaking in your mother tongue. Fine, I don't mind that at all. They talk about the historical trauma and how British oppression over 800 years has led to a mental health crisis in Ireland. I mean, all this nonsense that you see is entirely mainstream in the bourgeois media. That's what Kneecap gives voice to. There is nothing grassroots about them. There's nothing really working class about them. There's nothing radical about them. So in order to appear more radical, and in order to add a sense of edge to their otherwise quite bland worldview, they put on a balaclava, they say up the IRA.
I mean, it is radical.
I think what they're saying in relation to Israel is
But in relation to Ireland,
no, I think it's like it's basically fancy dress. If they were doing
I
all
think
of
they
that,
say they're satirical. I think that
yeah, they do.
When they're pushed into a corner about what they're saying, they say, "No, we're just a satirical band."
They've definitely said that about waving the Hezbollah flag and saying up Hamas, up Hezbollah. They say, "Oh no, we're just satire. We don't mean." I'm not buying that, because they're making statements on Israel and Palestine all the time, so they clearly believe this stuff. But when it's convenient for them, they'll say, "Oh, we're just a joke. We're just like Goldie looking chain. We're just having a bit of fun." I don't buy that, but I think, if they were doing all this Republican chic stuff back in 1984, when the conflict was raging and bombs were going off all the time, maybe then that would have been quite radical. But to do it now, it's basically historical fancy dress. And so the one thing I say to people, don't get too het up about, is the fact that they do this kind of fancy dress radicalism. It's just kind of a naff, pseudo-punkish approach. What I do think we should get het up about is what they say about Israel, and what they say about Hamas, and what they say about Hezbollah, because those are very dangerous ideas and pretty disgusting ideas, and I would say quite racist ideas, that they are communicating to a new audience.
But to hark back to the beginning of this conversation, those ideas with regards to Jews in Israel actually have popular support in Ireland, whereas the Republican stuff, or certainly the violent Republican stuff, maybe not so popular?
Yeah.
Is that the difference?
I think that's right.
Is that the difference between why you have a different attitude?
I think in Ireland it's just seen as ancient history. The ceasefire in the Troubles came into force in 1994. And then it was broken down and it came back into force in 96, 97. That's a long time ago. People were so happy to see the back of that conflict. So the Good Friday Agreement was put to the vote in both Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. In the Republic of Ireland, something like 92% of people voted for it. Like, it has an incredible amount of democratic legitimacy. In Northern Ireland, it was slightly less than that. I think it was in the 70%, because unionists didn't like it and some nationalists didn't like it, whatever. But on both sides of the border, it was enthusiastically embraced, because they were sick to the back teeth of this conflict, in which so many people, primarily young people, were being slaughtered all the time. It was just, and it was at a stalemate. No, the British didn't know where to go next. The IRA didn't know where to go next. That's why they were having their secret talks in the early 90s to try and bring this to an end. So people are glad to see the back of it. They definitely don't want it to come back. And I just think what Kneecap provides is a frisson of Republican radicalism to an audience of young people who have no historical memory of that at all. They don't remember the conflict. They weren't alive. They don't remember how awful it was. So that's what I think is going on there. It's a kind of, they're titillating a young audience with this kind of phony faux republicanism, which I don't think is that concerning. I think it's kind of ridiculous, actually, and pathetic and silly. What I do find concerning is that this is an increasingly popular band that has praised the worst act of fascist mass murder of our lifetimes. That's got to be taken more seriously.
Yeah. I'm going to attempt here a segue into our conversation that I want to have about immigration in Ireland. And that segue is that we have seen, for the first time, loyalists and Republicans marching side by side. So things have come on so far from the time you describe now that they are side by side. And this is as of August 2024, after the Southport murders in Britain. They are protesting against immigration into Ireland. And this is, as I described at the beginning of this conversation, come to a new place now with this bonfire of a refugee boat, I guess they would call it, or an immigrant boat. Before we get into the response to protests against immigration, can you just tell me what is the state of immigration into Ireland? How does it compare to Britain? What are they protesting?
Well, that boat, the migrant boat on the bonfire, I didn't like that. That made me uncomfortable. I mean, I don't think we should go too crazy about it, because the bonfires in Northern Ireland are famously crazy and it's like the Lewis bonfire in Sussex that they have on the 5th of November every year, where they often burn a political figure,
Right.
and it always causes a controversy, but it's just actually a bit of raucous
And in Northern Ireland, they do
fun.
that to celebrate the Battle of the Boyne
Yeah,
from
they
1690. It's always this time of year,
that's
right?
right.
This is,
Yeah, in the run up to the 12th of July and the victory of the Protestant king over the Catholic king at the Battle of the Boyne in 1690.
It's not completely
Throughout,
random. Yeah.
yeah. So exactly. So throughout July, particularly towards the 12th of July, they have these huge bonfires, and they will often put effigies of someone from politics or whatever. So it's kind of it's a very antsy kind of working class. It's got a real fuck you attitude to it. These bonfires, they really are like, you know, they're always crazy. So I wouldn't lose that much sleep over the fact that there was this effigy of a boat on them. I didn't like it. I don't think it's a nice thing to do. I personally wouldn't do it myself. But I'm struck by all the people who spent the past 2 weeks defending Bob Dylan chanting "Death to the IDF," suddenly getting het up because,
And indeed Kneecap.
and indeed Kneecap, and suddenly getting het up because of this effigy of a migrant boat. So there's so much hypocrisy in it. But immigration in Ireland, it's out of control. And we're heading towards a situation where 15 or more % of people in Ireland were born outside of Ireland. And it's getting higher and higher. That's a huge proportion of the country, of a small country like Ireland. It's similar, and in fact, it's now almost the same as the percentage of people who were born outside of New York. In New York, in the era in which New York was referred to as the melting pot of the world, the late 1800s, the early 1900s, around that time, about 18% of people in New York were born outside of New York. And that was a huge, bustling, emerging world power of a city. Ireland's a small country.
It's about, what is it, 4 or 5 million population?
Yeah, yeah.
Dublin's about 1 million, is that right?
Yeah,
Something like that.
This is a small country. There's more people in Greater London than there is in Ireland. It's not an economic powerhouse, and yet the immigrants keep coming.
So where are they coming from? Who are the immigrants?
They're similar to the immigrants that we get in the UK. So some of them may even be the people who come to Britain illegally on boats and then they cross and go to Ireland. They're coming from North Africa. They're coming from sub-Saharan Africa. They're coming from the Middle East. They're coming from those parts of the world.
Presumably they're not getting on boats from the continent, right? If they're getting on boats, because that's quite a distance to do.
Yeah.
So if they're coming on boats, it's from Britain.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Or from Northern Ireland.
A lot of them come through past the border. So they're in the UK and they can come from they go to Northern Ireland and then they come down through the border to the Irish Republic. But it's hard to describe. It's like this vast social experiment being carried out by the ruling classes of Dublin. So what they do, it's really imperious. So they will actually look on a map of Ireland and pick a town and say, right, 85 men from Africa can go to this town. We'll put them up in the local hall, or we'll commandeer the hotel in that town and turn it into a migrant center. And I'm talking about towns. Some of these towns I know. Some of them are in Connemara in the west of Ireland. They're all over the country. I know these towns. These are small towns where everyone is from the same kind of background. There might be 1 or 2 pubs. There might be a church. There might be a few shops. It's a very local town. It's very green. It's surrounded by countryside. There might be, 700 people live in there or 1,000 people live in there. And then suddenly, overnight, you have this new intake of people from a different culture, a different country, many of whom can't speak English, certainly not Irish. That has an impact. And it's not racist to say that has an impact, that has an impact on people's lives, on their sense of what their town is, who it's for, who's in charge of it. If someone in Dublin can just point to a map and say, put them there. Immigration is the issue through which people in Ireland most keenly feel their dislocation from political life and their disenfranchisement from political life, because they feel it's an issue they have no control over. It's imposed on them, they feel very strongly, by the Dublin elites. They're not allowed to talk about it. Talk about it and you're a racist, you're a xenophobe. What's wrong with you? Why won't you get with the new Ireland? You're backward, you're aggressive. If they march about it, they'll be called fascists in all the newspapers. there's no other issue through which people in Ireland, and it's similar here in the UK, they feel that sense of elite contempt on this issue and that sense of powerlessness, because they are powerless on this issue and it is very much imposed on them. And immigration is now the hottest topic in Ireland. People are incredibly angry about it.
Right.
They're demanding questions. And I think there will come a breaking point when something will have to change.
Okay, so in Britain, some of the immediate effects that we've seen, which anyone listening to this show will be well aware of, is that we've got enclaves where not only do they not speak English and so are not integrating, but as of last year, we saw various riots. Hare Hills, we saw riots from the Romani Muslim population. In Rochdale, we saw riots, and this is all. Where else did we saw them? South End. We saw them in Whitechapel in the Bengali community in London. So not only that, but then we have the counter protests. But we'll come back to that. We see the newcomers have a much higher propensity to are committing crimes at much higher levels. Afghans, for example, significantly more sexual offences and rape than any other group. And it's a burden on the economy. And there's people arguing that it's good for the economy, but if you actually look at it, a lot of these people are not working. So what are in Ireland, how is this manifesting? Like, where are the problems? Are we seeing, like, is there a grooming gangs version scandal over there? What is provoking that this is becoming the hottest issue in the country?
There's nothing on the industrial scale of the grooming gang scandal in Ireland, but there have been some extremely violent crimes carried out by migrants, carried out by people who have come to Ireland from somewhere else, including murder of a young woman, the murder of two gay guys.
When was this?
A couple of years back, 2 years ago. The huge anti-migrant riots that rocked Dublin 2 years ago, which was some of the worst riots Dublin has seen for many, many years, that was provoked by a man who attacked some girls in Dublin with a knife. I don't think there were any fatalities in that one, but it was a pretty gross attack.
This was November 23. I remember this.
That's right.
Yeah.
And there was a huge, pretty ugly riot. Buses were burnt, streets were taken over by rioters. And it was a real, I refer to it at the time as the fury of the cancelled. Because if you continually suppress people's concerns about immigration, and not only suppress them, but demonize them as beyond the pale, unacceptable, things that shouldn't be given voice to, hateful and dangerous, that's how they're referred to. If you put a lid on that, at some point the lid's going to blow off, because people need an outlet to express their concerns. And if they can't do it at the ballot box because there's no parties representing their views, if they can't do it in public speeches because they'll be taken off the streets and called racist, they will blow up in another way. So the elites really are making a tinderbox of this issue by making immigration into the means through which they demonstrate their own virtue. So the way in which the elites in Dublin, and it's similar here, the way in which they prove that they are virtuous people to themselves and to other establishments in Europe, the way they do that is by being hyper pro-immigration. We're so enlightened, we're so socially aware, we're post-white, we're post-nationhood, we're post-borders, we know that Ireland is for everyone. That's really the means through which they say we're good people. And the way in which they say that other Irish people are bad and regressive and stuck in the past is by pointing to their concerns about migration. So it's become not only a question of the problem that mass migration might pose for the economy or for politics or local culture, local stability, and all those other questions, but it's become enmeshed with the whole question of virtue. If you're a virtuous person, you're supposed to fling open your doors and say, come to Ireland. If you're a wicked person and possibly even borderline fascist, you're the one who says, stop bringing them in. Let's think about this. Let's have a conversation. So that's it. That's why, I mean, it has a very imperious feel to it now, where you really do have this establishment in Dublin, which has utter contempt for people around the country, sees them as racist and Europhobic and xenophobic, and imposes on them, these newcomers to the country, who don't understand Irish culture, don't speak the local language, and don't understand what Ireland's about. It's such a dangerous strategy for the government to take.
Yeah, and we've seen these writers called far right, as you say. Actually, in mainstream media in Britain, they're calling them far right. It's exactly the same thing they're doing in this country. Who could forget Sir Keir Starmer, our Prime Minister, calling everyone the far right after the Southport riots. Horrible as the riots were, and I'm no fan of rioting, but in this country, it seems like there is a political rebellion, or let's say a rebellion that's manifesting at the political level. Various different right-wing parties who are coming out and openly talking about it, as well as in media. There's you at the Spectator, you at Spiked, GB News. There are people calling it out for what it is. In Ireland, what is the response? Is there I saw a MMA fighter, Conor McGregor, world famous, of course, who's got his own sort of sordid past, but he's sort of talking about throwing his hat in the ring, in the political ring. How is this going? How is this manifesting at the political domain?
Yeah, it's so interesting. I often think about the striking difference between how Conor McGregor is talked about and how Kneecap are talked about. So Conor McGregor is seen as this incredibly dangerous figure. And when he went to the White House to talk to Donald Trump and he made that statement about Ireland is not Ireland anymore, the Irishness is being taken away from it through mass immigration, the response in Ireland was psychotic.
Really?
It was insane. I mean, you had columnists in the Irish Times and other newspapers and on RTE, which is their version of the BBC, saying this is dangerous, he's a menace, he should shut his mouth, he's going to provoke people to violence. I mean, really treating him as this crazy guy. Kneecap, of course, is seen as perfectly fine. And I think it's because of the different audiences. Kneecap speaks to a primarily middle-class, well-to-do audience, time-rich, money-rich, people who go to gigs and wave the Palestine flag, both in Ireland and in the UK. They speak to relatively privileged young people, so they're not seen as a problem. Conor McGregor has the ear of the Irish working class, or sections of it. Not all of it. Some of them think he's an idiot. Some of them think he treats women very badly, and it seems that he does. So not all of them, but there are sections of the Irish working class, especially in Dublin, but elsewhere as well, who are so enraged by what's happening and so irritated by Micheál Martin and Simon Harris, who run the country, that they are looking for someone else. They're looking for someone who gives voice to their concerns, and Conor McGregor does. And, it's interesting because aside from him, there's very little going on in Ireland in terms of a critical response to all this stuff. That hasn't really come out yet. I mean, there are some voices here and there, and not only in Ireland, but in the UK, there are voices who talk about Ireland as well. So those voices are there, but they haven't formed into anything more substantial. They're still struggling to be heard. And I think that's pretty dangerous, because unless Ireland opens up its political culture and opens up this discussion in particular and has an honest, frank self-reflection on whether it's the right thing to be doing, then we're in trouble. But, right now, Ireland is governed by an elite that is more concerned with impressing the kind of gold-collared superclass of the globalist institutions at the European Union and the UN and those kind of behind-the-scenes movers and shakers in Europe. It feels much more solidarity with those people than it does with its own populace. It's much more interested in their opinion than it is in the opinion of some farmer from the west of Ireland. It's much more interested in impressing Ursula von der Leyen than it is in doing what a woman's group in Cork might want it to do in relation to migrant and male violence. So that's the fundamental problem in Dublin. It's governed by a class of people who obsess more over how they appear on the world stage than how they are repairing their own nation. And that's a real problem.
So what's next for Ireland then? Is it just the way you say it there is like you're not quite sure how it's going to pan out, but there's a tension in the air that is unresolved.
There is a tension in the air, and it expresses itself in all sorts of interesting ways. I mean, Sinn Féin has become a more popular party in the south of Ireland because people see it as not the two main parties. So the two main parties in Ireland are Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. They map, I think, to a certain extent. Fianna Fáil would be seen as the more Labourish party and Fine Gael is the more conservative party. It doesn't exactly work like that. But those were the two parties that ran Ireland since the Civil War. They both emerged from the Civil War. The Fianna Fáil was the part of the Civil War that wanted to have the whole country freed from Britain, and Fine Gael was the side that agreed to the partition of Ireland. So both of those parties come from the Civil War. They're defined by that era of the 1920s. And they're both exhausted institutions. They don't know what they stand for anymore. Both of them have fallen into the woke trap. Sinn Féin has emerged from the sidelines as a vehicle for people who are annoyed with those two main parties. But then Sinn Féin is even more woke. Sinn Féin is even more pro-EU. Sinn Féin's leaders are even more pro-trans.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, there's a very interesting conflict in Sinn Féin at the moment on the trans question, where the leadership is saying trans women are women, and more local councillors and local politicians are saying no, they're not. So it'd be worth that's another expression of those tensions in Irish politics. But you know, it's very hard to see what happens next in Ireland. You know, there have been populist revolts around the world. I mean, I like to say that Britain led the charge with the vote for Brexit, which I voted for, and I was very, very happy to do so, to be part of that 17.4 million who said, we want to change the face of politics. We want to reclaim our sovereign destiny from EU officials we don't know and never voted for. I thought that was a very positive stab for a resuscitation of British democracy. That kind of then opened the floodgates to Trumpism, you know, the Trump phenomenon, which for all its faults was unquestionably a revolt of tens of millions of kind of cross-race working class communities who wanted to shake up the old establishment. We see it in Europe. There's been populist revolts in Sweden, in Italy, in Spain, both of the left-wing variety and the right-wing variety. So it's happening in different ways, but I cannot see how it will happen in Ireland. There's no force that has that energy or that desire to do something different, nipping at the heels of the establishment.
Yeah.
So the establishment is there. They rule, but not very convincingly. They rule often in opposition to the concerns and desires of their own people. And it's a very undesirable, tense situation. And at some point, something will break, but it's hard to see how or when.
Before we go over to take questions specifically for you from our Substack viewers and listeners, we've been really laying it into Ireland through this conversation. And I wondered if we might... Obviously, you love Ireland.
Yeah.
I can see that from the Irish ring. And as you said, your family from Ireland. I wondered maybe we could sort of, not maybe attempt a white pill or some sort of positive note to end on the country. You know, when I was full-time a musician, I was playing constantly in Ireland, and the best crowd you can play to.
Yeah.
Everyone can play an instrument. You go into any pub, everyone starts playing. It's an amazing, deep culture. It's a proud heritage in many respects, even though we've explored some of the not so proud aspects of their heritage. What's the Brendan O'Neill positive look on Ireland?
Ireland's a great country, despite everything we've just been talking about. In fact, one of the reasons I talk about this stuff is because I love Ireland so much, and I don't want it to go any further down these problematic roads that it's going down. Ireland's a great country. I go there all the time. I particularly go to the West, which is where all my ancestors are from. Both of my parents are from the west of Ireland. It's the most beautiful part of the world. And Galway City is one of my favourite cities, even though it's hyper woke. But you can overlook that because there's great pubs. There's that ingrained culture that you talk about. Music is playing everywhere. I mean, it sounds so cliched to say all of this stuff. It sounds so cliched to say, you know, Ireland's got great pubs and great music and great culture, but it has. And you can live a fine life there. And the people, for the most part, are good people. But, you know, I don't like it when people say that the Irish are, you know, the nicest people in the world, and they're all saying top of the morning, which they don't say, by the way. You know, because then it does become a caricature. The Irish are like everyone else. There's good people, there's bad people. There's good ideas, there's bigoted ideas. You know, it's got a lot of energy, but it also has a lot of problematic ideology and history. So I wouldn't want to over-glamorize it, but it is, in my view, a great country that is currently being sold short to a catastrophic degree by the people who rule it. You know, it's like a masterclass in how to kill a republic. You know, whatever one might think about the bloody origins of this country called Ireland, born out of the Easter Uprising and the War of Independence and the Civil War and lots of death and destruction and everything else. It had a tumultuous birth. Yeats famously described the new island as a terrible beauty. So a beautiful thing, but a terrible thing, and an unformed thing. 6 of the counties were still in the United Kingdom and the Catholic Church was still ruling things. So he called it a terrible beauty, which I thought is a very good way to describe this country. Whatever you think about the origins of Ireland, it was, for a period of time, an aspirant republic. It inspired national liberation struggles around the world. India, Vietnam, Israel. Ireland really lit the flame for all of that by doing it in 1916, long before others had done it. Ho Chi Minh, who would go on controversially or otherwise to lead the liberation of Vietnam, he was famously working in a hotel in London in the 1910s. There's a blue plaque on the building where he worked. And he was massively moved and inspired by what was happening in Ireland. Now, that might be seen as a bad thing that Ireland gave rise to, but it's indicative of the extent to which Ireland has punched above its weight politically. And I think there's a lot to take pride in those values. We'll leave Ho Chi Minh to one side, but in those values of national liberation, the desire to have your own country, the desire for it to be a free country. If you read the Declaration of the Irish Republic that was pinned at the General Post Office in 1916, it's an inspiring document. They didn't live up to it. They didn't bring in the equality and the liberty that they promised, but they tried. There's a lot in Irish history to be proud of. There's a lot in Irish culture to love. There's a lot in the country itself to admire. But if we're going to keep that, then we need to do something about the ruling class.
Maybe you should go back and run for office.
Me and Conor.
Yeah. Brendan Neal, before we do go over to the Substack to take those questions, is there anything you'd like to bring viewers' attention to? How to find you online? Obviously, your books, Heretics Manifesto, A Duty to Offend, and After the Pogrom, which I highly recommend. Are there other books like these 3?
Those are the 3.
There's more on the horizon, though.
There's more on the horizon, I hope, but let's not tempt fate.
Yes.
I think they find me at Spiked. That's people should read Spiked. Fantastic magazine. I write there every week. I'm the chief political writer there. I'm on Instagram, but
you're not on Twitter. That's right.
I'm not on Twitter.
You're controversially not on Twitter.
I've never used X in my life. I'm not on Facebook. I'm only hiding away on Instagram, so hoping no one finds me, but they can find me there. I guess the thing I would like people to read after this conversation is After the Pogrom, because that's the book I wrote, on the anniversary of the pogrom, on the 7th of October last year. And I wrote it quickly from a place of anger, but also hoping to bring a bit of moral clarity to all of this. So I think that's probably what people should read if they want to know what I think in more depth about all this stuff.
Yeah, great. Brendan O'Neill, thank you so much.
Thank you.
So, Brendan, these are questions from our Substack readers and viewers. Assuming a reform UK government is returned at the next general election, will Britain be far too broken for any remedial measures to get us back on track, i.e. as a truly great Britain? She says pick one. I like the first one because it's about Jeffrey Epstein. You were critical of the conspiracy theories that surrounded it. Can you expand on your thoughts? Because I want to know your take on Jeffrey Epstein.
Yeah, I hate conspiracy theories. I think
Are we allowed to criticize Israeli policy?
I've been thinking about this.
Thank you for watching the Winston Marshall Show with Brendan O'Neill. If you head over to winstonmarshall.co.uk right now, you'll get an extended conversation between me and Brendan where he takes some of your questions. We took a little bit of a deep dive into Jeffrey Epstein and the latest revelations from Washington, D.C. and the conspiracies surrounding that ongoing case. Thank you for watching. And if you want to support the show, remember, all you have to do is press subscribe wherever you get your podcasts from. And until next time, be well.